I would also like to offer a special thanks this evening to the sponsor of this event and our other Awards Week programming, FS Investments, for their support of this programming and the role as associate sponsor of the awards ceremony and dinner itself. It's now my pleasure to introduce a good friend of the Institute from FS Investments, Mia Fioravanti from FS. Mia, thank you for being here, and thanks for all your support of this program.
Thank you, Larry, and good evening, everyone. As Larry said, my name is Mia Fioravanti, and I am Director of Corporate Social Responsibility for FS Investments, proud sponsor of the Franklin Institute's Awards Week. It is a pleasure to be here tonight to celebrate the contributions of 3 laureates to the world of science. Dr. Jayatri, the Institute's Chief Bioscientist, will introduce tonight's esteemed guest in just a moment. 8 people, including, for the first time ever, 2 women Bauer Award winners, have forever impacted the fields of science, technology, and business. They will join the ranks of Albert Einstein, Marie Curie, and Jane Goodall. Awards Week is such an exciting time, and not only because of this week's ceremony and dinner, but also because of events like tonight's event, when we hear the stories and contributions of this year's laureates. We at FS Investments, through our foundation work, are deeply committed to expanding educational outreach in the region, which is why we are so proud to support the work of this organization that is shaping the lives of children and adults alike. These efforts are at the heart of the Franklin Institute's mission to inspire a passion for learning about science and technology. So with that, I would like to thank the staff and volunteers of the Franklin Institute for their hard work and dedication to this year's Awards Week, and a special thanks to President and CEO Larry Dubinsky for his leadership. And thanks to all of you for joining us for tonight to celebrate these remarkable individuals. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jayatri Das.
Thank you so much, Mia, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. So when I thought about this connection between basic research and the transition to industry, I was reminded of a conversation that I had with my father when I was finishing up college and deciding to go to graduate school. Now, my dad worked in the aerospace industry as an engineer for 40 years. And so when I told him that I wanted to do my PhD in evolutionary biology, he looked at me like, what are you ever going to do with that? And at the time, I didn't really have a good answer for him. I kind of waved my hands and said, no, I'm sure I'll get grant funding for the rest of my life to do basic research. But it wasn't until I learned about Francis Arnold's work that I realized that wherever you look, there are connections between fundamental research and applications in real-world technologies. So reflecting on that, it's a special moment for me tonight to bring together these 3 laureates who have done this throughout their careers. It takes a special mindset to be able to bridge that gap from academic research, especially, to the industry world. There's a difference in cultures, in communications, in challenges and rewards. But at the end of the day, it's really cool to be able to start with that fundamental science and take it all the way to see it then transform the real world. So tonight, we're going to start off with 3 short videos to introduce you to the work of these esteemed scientists. I'll start off the conversation following the videos by inviting them on stage and asking them with a few questions, and I invite all of you to join the conversation as well.
The maker of pharmaceuticals, detergents, fuels, and more, the chemical manufacturing industry is one of the largest in the world.
Some people accuse me of practicing chemistry without a license. But I think chemistry belongs to whoever does it.
And because of Francis Arnold, it's using an innovative method that cuts costs, softens impacts on the environment, and allows us to create new, sometimes life-saving chemicals and drugs. Arnold's process, called directed evolution, encourages bacteria to evolve to produce molecules called enzymes that are precisely designed to carry out the specific reactions we need. Almost impossible to produce in any other way, these engineered enzymes give chemical engineers new tools to create new families of chemicals. John Rogers is covered with technology, literally.
We're sort of surrounded in materials, and materials innovations.
Inspired by the possibility of electrically mapping the human brain, Rogers developed a breakthrough electronic material that can flex and conform to human skin and organs. Using it, he's designed battery-free heart monitors for hospitalized infants, a cardiac wrap that may one day replace pacemakers, a sweat analysis patch launched commercially by Gatorade, and an assortment of filaments that electrically integrate with brain cells and nerve tissue. With widespread applications across many industries, Rogers' discoveries open the door to a future of wearable technology. Nothing moves faster than light, and yet Eli Yablonovich found a way to trap it.
Light is everywhere around us. It's part of our physiology, it's part of us. So it has a big impact everywhere.
Born in a World War II-era refugee camp, Yablonovich would rise to world renown for his discovery of photonic crystals, materials that can confine the light that enters them. They've made lasers and solar panels more efficient, and they power the fiber optic backbone of a new mobile data network currently under construction. The network is capable of blazingly fast download speeds that will unleash a new generation of mobile devices and forever alter how we communicate and work together.
And so now I'd like to invite our laureates to join me on stage to start a conversation. So I want to start by asking you to go back to the beginning. When you first started your research career, I'm not sure that you ever imagined that you'd end up where you are today. And so help us understand what that initial challenge that you wanted to tackle was. And maybe we can start here and go down the line, but please feel free to jump in on each other's sentences.
Yeah, I guess I'm first trying to identify where the starting point would be, right? So how far back you go. But maybe I'll start with my kind of independent career. So I got my career start at Bell Laboratories. Eli was there as well at a different time, but it was a storied industrial lab that was, I think, sort of world class in terms of the science that was going on, but a very strong connection to challenges in technology and broader societal impact. And so I think that Bell Labsian worldview has stayed with me as I've moved through my career. I was there for 5 years, from '97 through end of 2002. In those days, we were working on flexible electronic devices. We were thinking about plastic-based semiconductors and what you could do in consumer electronics, gadgetry, flexible displays, paper-like displays, things like that. We did some things in fiber optics and other areas as well. I think when I set up my own sort of labs in an academic context, when I moved to University of Illinois 2003, we decided that those kind of technologies were interesting, but maybe it was more compelling to think of them in the context of the human body. So flexibility and soft mechanical properties, sort of stretchability, it was a different type of mechanics response, would potentially allow you to take sort of the advanced electronic functionality that's kind of ubiquitous in our consumer world, but is in this sort of flat, planar, rigid geometry and adopt it to conform with soft tissues of the human body. So this notion of biocompatible electronics became really interesting to us, and I think it became sort of a compelling direction for the students as well. I mean, because as an academic, you're kind of an educator and you want to train the next generation, and the idea of being able to bring materials science, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering to bear on new classes of devices that could have a positive impact on how we think about human healthcare became a very compelling direction for us, and a broader problem statement around how do you think about electronic materials, how do you do manufacturing of electronic devices which offer the kind of sophistication in operation that you see in the consumer gadgetry world, but rendered in these biocompatible forms. So that was kind of the starting point for us. It was back in 2003, roughly, and we began to establish collaborations with clinicians, physicians, rehabilitation scientists, and so on. And that has been kind of a target application area that has sort of helped to guide sort of selections in what scientific problems we study, right, in the academic lab, and has also established a translational potential for getting the technology out.
So really starting with that fundamental component of the flexible electronics and then expanding from there. How about you?
Well, I'm a child of the 70s. There was a lot of disruption in oil supply and disruption in our lives, Vietnam War. There were a lot of protests going on, and I wanted to be part of the solution So I went into the nascent biofuels industry. Actually, in the Solar Energy Research Institute, we had a national goal of 20% renewable energy by the year 2000 when Carter was president. That's what I wanted to contribute to. But then the minute I got there, there was a change of administration, and I needed a new career. I've believed in evolution as an opportunity for adaptation and change. So I went to graduate school at the beginning of the DNA revolution. And I took on these new technologies of being able to read and write DNA for the first time, manipulating DNA. And then later on, I put that all together, renewable energy, sustainability, and using biology as a way to solve those problems. But it was a very twisty turn.
And it's fascinating to hear how some of these social trends going on around you really influenced your thinking.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to solar energy, that's very much in line with your thinking as well.
Yes, I've done quite a bit on solar energy, but I wanted to answer your question more directly.
Yeah.
You asked when we got started. When did we start thinking this way? And I go back and I try to, well, when did I start thinking this way? And I remember Sputnik. I was 10 years old, and Sputnik was a shock all over the world, especially in America. And I remember being there, and my parents had some other adults over, and they were talking about Sputnik and how serious it was and so on. I was listening to the adults talking about this, and it was worrisome, and but it was science. And so, oh, wow, yeah, maybe there is something to this science stuff. And little did I know, all over the world, but especially here in America, there were huge repercussions. Vast amounts of money were spent in Southern California trying to catch up, but in my own little way, at the age of 10, I said, oh my God, the adults seem to think this is very important. Maybe I better get into this.
And so that then sparked your interest that grew into solar energy and
No,
light
it was
and
many other
nuclear.
things.
So another circuitous
Oh,
path.
it started out just watching the termites eat the fence posts in the backyard, and then trying experiments like, what if I pretend it's raining and I pour a glass of water onto the termites? How do they recover, and so on.
So even more basic that
Yeah.
need to experiment.
And it was a time when any kind of science had great prestige, even if it was a little thing like that.
Boy, times have changed.
Yeah, we like to think here that there's still a certain prestige in science.
Among a limited set.
This audience.
But it is interesting to think about how your science exists within the context of the larger world. And if we think about how that influences your work today, how do you see the growth of what you're doing and how that fits into today's problems?
Well, I mean, I think for us, healthcare represents sort of a grand challenge for society. Like, how do we improve the way that we're delivering healthcare? How do we extend quality of life, healthy life? And so I think it sort of provides an orientation for the kind of science that we're doing. I should mention, that it's not all academics that have an aspiration to move things out of the lab and kind of into the real world. Is certainly something that we've been interested in. And I think as an educator, you manage a group. At least my approach is not to be a taskmaster and sort of rigidly define a framework that people plug into and then move forward on. And so, in some ways, you're kind of responsive and susceptible to the interests and the passions of your students, right? And you allow them to kind of follow their own interests. And I think it sort of self-assembles in directions like, for us, healthcare, or photovoltaics might be another area, alternative energy, right? And so it's kind of an interesting give and take between the advisor and the student that defines, an overall research trajectory for a group.
And so when you talk about back in the Carter administration, we're shooting for 20% solar energy by the year 2000. We're not there yet, but some of your work is getting us there. Where do you see the challenge in the industry today? And I'll start with Eli, since that's specifically related to your work.
Yeah, there's been a tremendous amount of progress, and in California, I believe we've reached 20% effectively. In fact, this time of year, it's April, you can get free electricity in California in the middle of the day because they installed way too many solar panels. It's coming, and undoubtedly, in due course, it'll be the dominant source of energy for civilization. I don't doubt that for a minute, but it's like every other energy transition, it takes a very long time and more than one lifetime to see the total change transform. But I think of that, I was trying to anticipate what else you were going to ask, and that is, whatever it is, whether it's solar energy or some other thing, we try to make things better for mankind. I've always felt that I should be doing work that is not just looking at the stars, for example, but something that actually people can change their lives with, make their lives better. And I think maybe some of the other panelists have shared that.
Well, we're all engineers, right? All of us.
Yeah.
I was trained as an engineer, aerospace engineering and chemical engineering. I got the Nobel Prize in chemistry, and everybody's grumbling on the chemistry side. But this focus on solving real problems, you take human health. I want the health of the planet. That's what I care about. All the other creatures that we have to share it with. And I'm thrilled that I'm able to use my skills and talents to do that.
So you've each mentioned, a personal motivation to make a difference in the context of a larger problem that you saw in the world. Yet, along the way, you each kind of broke a paradigm and that drew a lot of skepticism at the time. Can you tell us a little bit about those challenges that you faced and how you were able to break through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenges, at least for me, were very real. I mean, I think if you're kind of going in a different direction, there are all kinds of hurdles and obstacles that you kind of need to overcome. I mean, one of the great things about being a university professor is if you can find funding to do it, you can do it, right? There are really no further constraints beyond that financial one. So when I was a graduate student at MIT, I remember I TA'd for a physics professor who was teaching a large undergraduate course, and he had some discretionary funding. He used to pay undergraduates to research UFOs, like UFO sightings. Were they real or not? So you can do anything, right? If you can get the funding to do it, and that's a great thing, right? So I would say that all of the, I would say, sort of new directions that we've been able to take our research have been done in kind of a bootstrapped, kind of under the radar type of approach. I don't think we've ever written a proposal to a federal agency that was awarded to do research outside of what people appreciated at the mainstream as mainstream science, right? So you kind of have to bootstrap it, but then once things start to work and people can understand what you're doing, then you can go back to those funding agencies and sort of pay for it. And as things begin to mature, then you have opportunities to engage with industry, and they can help sort of support the activities. You can start companies. You can do everything. But my experience is you have to sort of, by hook or by crook, figure out how to get it started, because you're not going to be able to go through the standard channels to do things that are different, because there's a lot of risk associated with funding those outside of the box kind of activities. I mean, I think people used to say, you never got fired for investing in IBM, right? If you're a stock picker, right? The same thing applies to program managers. If you pick research projects that are in well-defined spaces, on well-defined, understood materials, then that was a safe choice. And to kind of go outside of that, it represents a risk, right? And it represents a risk for the review panels as well. So anyway, that's been my experience. It's very hard to fund things in new directions, but there are other ways to do it because of the way the university environment is set up.
So when you talk about starting a new direction, that reminds me, Eli, of a story I've heard you tell about even coming up with the name of photonic crystals. Can you share that story and talk about how that helped you kind of overcome a threshold?
Well, it's sort of branding, right? You do something really good in science, and nobody understands it, and says, well, how can I get this across to people? So you try to come up with a good name, and there people come up with great names. I think one of my favorite names is Spintronics, and But anyone here who comes up with a name, and people use it, that's actually a big deal. So here's how I like to express it. William Shakespeare, everyone knows William Shakespeare. He's very famous. He contributed about 1,000 words to the English language, words that we use every day. And you can look this up online. There's a list of all the words that William Shakespeare contributed. Now, if somebody contributes one word, which is like a lifetime achievement, if you contribute one word, then it's a Millie Shakespeare.
How many Millie Shakespeares do you have?
I only have one.
But just naming and establishing your idea is such an important part of it.
But I think the original question was, do you get resistance? And if you have a new idea, you get resistance. Yes, you get tremendous resistance. And this is ever puzzling to me. Why can't they see what I see? Okay, and there's resistance, and finally I came to realize, well, if they had seen it, it wouldn't be an original discovery, right? And so there's a certain mental resistance against something new. Oh, you have something new? Well, chances are it doesn't work, and chances are that it's not going to be the scientific breakthrough you're claiming it is, and so on and so forth. As a matter of fact, why not just forget about whatever you're saying? So it's kind of hard to get people to accept something new, but I've accepted them now.
That's very generous of you. But Frances, you've encountered this as well.
Well, mine mostly came from my daring to cross disciplinary boundaries and work on problems that people thought belonged to them. And using methods, oh my goodness, I met people like your father all through my career saying, evolution, oh my goodness, how could you use evolution to make new molecules? That's not science. Well, I'm an engineer, so I said, okay. They said, well, gentlemen don't use evolution. You know, it's all these random mutations. And I said, well, I'm not a gentleman. So maybe I'll just keep on doing it. And yeah, so that worked for me. But sometimes it's hard to survive that criticism and skepticism that people look at you with if you're trying to do a problem in a completely new way.
So we have an audience question that I think gets at some of this idea of interdisciplinary work. And it's a specific question about what was it about Bell Labs for you, John, that really led to these new ideas and innovations. But I think what we often think of when we think of Bell Labs is about the diversity of people who work there and the ideas that are shared. So we can start with Bell Labs, but I'd love to hear about each of your experiences with working across fields.
Yeah, I mean, I think collaboration has been kind of a hallmark of the way that we've done science, over the last 20, 25 years. I think, if you have a core expertise and you can work effectively with other people who have other expertise in additional domains, then you can really highly leverage yourself, right, and actually do better science, more impactful engineering. So, as a recent example, and this is kind of a high water mark for us, but we had a paper in Science on March 1st that involved skin interface devices for vital signs monitoring in the NICU, in an actual NICU at Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago, and there were 45 co-authors. I mean, it was material science, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering. There was computer science because we were doing in-sensor data analytics. There were nurses, doctors, graduate students, undergrads, postdocs. So it's like an amazing thing, and it's not easy. But I think if you can pull the right people together, you can actually increase the depth of the technical content and the breadth of impact. And so I don't know. I mean, like I said, I got my career start at Bell Labs, and I maintain that Bell Labsian kind of worldview. But the labs themselves were specifically engineered from the standpoint of the architecture, even the architecture of how the labs were laid out to enhance sort of probability that people would cross paths, right? So we have a long corridor, you'd have to walk down to get to the lunchroom, and you'd bump into different people, and you'd kind of interact. You didn't, as you do in a university, have a halo of grad students and postdocs that sort of isolate the senior PIs, and so it was sort of one-on-one interactions between like the world's best, physicists, right? The guy who was in charge of the physics lab when I was hired was Horst Stormer. He won the Nobel Prize the next year. The guy who won the Nobel Prize in physics the previous year was Steve Chu, who was also, so he had incredible talent mixed together, right, in a highly interdisciplinary way in the context of an engineering company that had specific technical challenges they needed to worry about. And so it wasn't science in isolation in an ivory tower, sort of mixed in with challenges around how do we do telecommunications. And so I think it's a very powerful model, you know, for not only doing science, but science that has a broader meaning, right, and a stronger sort of impact on society. It's a very appealing way to do science from my standpoint.
How do you see that culture and mindset translated to the spheres that you've worked in?
Caltech sounds just like Bell Labs. We're the size of a high school, 900 students, 300 professors. It's a tiny place, but everything's all mixed together. And a student who comes to Caltech can work in astrophysics or biology, they get to choose. So that means that I can recruit to my group, which is in the chemistry division, computer scientists or biologists or engineers or biochemists. We all just mix them together. And that enabled me to take these very different routes to solving chemical problems that would have been impossible to do in a more traditional environment. So these wonderful laboratories like Bell Labs, this model is tremendously powerful. And our academic system often makes that so difficult. And they silo technologies in different departments.
Well, I've tried to understand things outside my own field. And on one side was medicine, on the other side was high energy physics, and I thought I was responsible for everything in between. So I think it helps to be friendly, and then you get to meet other scientists and you can make some of those connections. I think those are terrific things. Bell Labs, I was also there, was a great place for science, but I was honestly very frustrated there because I saw so many great opportunities being unpursued, wasted. They didn't understand what business they were in, and unfortunately, when they had to compete like a normal company, that came to the fore. And I could go on and on about all the reasons why we don't have Bell Labs anymore. But it's okay. They were great because they could attract the best people in the world, and then they scattered them out into the whole world, and they've done extraordinarily well, and they've just great accomplishments.
Caltech hired them.
Some of them were hired. Yes, that's right. The universities hired many of them. Many of them went other
good.
places. I had people working for me there, and like they're famous software people, and they were like more experimentalists, but then they had to adapt and adjust. Bell Labs was so great in its time, anybody who got a job offer from Bell Labs went to Bell Labs. They just got the best people, period. And so those are some of the good things. But what has replaced that? So I asked myself, what has replaced that? And it's a little bit hard to identify it. Maybe it's been replaced by something that is it's more functional. You still have great scientists. For example, the startup culture in the San Francisco Bay Area. You have wonderful scientists. They do useful things. They're also wonderful. They do science on the side. Yeah. It works out.
So what motivated you to make the leap and try and branch out beyond the research lab into the business world? Francis, maybe we can start with you.
I think it's very simple. It's easy to claim that something's useful. You find that in every academic paper you read. This is useful for. But in my world, it's not useful unless someone uses it. Right? That seems a simple definition of useful. And people won't use it unless you help translate that basic discovery into the real world, right? To make the products that people will actually buy. So when you have a bright student who says, I want to change the world, which has happened to me several times, and they say, no, I don't want to be a professor like you. I want to change the world. Say, good, let's do it. And that has been a tremendously just invigorating part of my career. Of course, I keep my day job just in case, limit the risks, but to see the technology get out into people's hands where it really makes an impact is wonderful.
Well, it's sort of the ambition that Frances just told us is to actually change the world. And those things are true. But I can recall my first week, I had been in industry, I had gone back to UCLA, and somebody told me, well, you ought to meet Henry Samueli. So I said, Henry, can you come to lunch? And he described his new company called Broadcom. And he said, well, I think this is going to be a $50 million company someday. And he was off by 3 orders of magnitude. And so you say, well, yeah, you can do that. And so he is, of course, a great philanthropist now. So there's the element of trying to change the world. But is anybody here greedy? Am I the only one who's greedy?
We're all human.
So there's that element. But I finally figured out how to do it. You know, and that is find an unmet need in society and meet that need. And you will do very well. And that's the whole secret. Okay. Just find something that society needs and do it.
And it sounds a little bit like you're almost channeling that skepticism you encounter and realizing that you are, in fact, the most effective advocate for translating your work into something practical.
Well, the other side of it, though, it's not just us. We learn so much from interacting with the real world, right? You learn what are the hardest problems, what are the real problems versus the ones that you dream up in the laboratory. So throughout my career, from the very beginning, I had connections with industry who would bring me problems that no one else could solve. We were engineering proteins. We said it was useful. We said we had methods that no one else could mimic. But it wasn't until we actually solved problems that no one else could solve that people realized, yes, these methods really are useful. And I'm glad I did that, because then 30 years later, I get some little invitation from Stockholm.
And John, you get invitations from companies, who are looking to then leverage your technology in so many different ways.
Yeah, right. So I would just kind of add to what Frances is saying. I mean, I think the translational stuff actually enhances the science beyond just helping you choose what scientific topics are kind of worth studying, but the technology that emerges from the commercial aspects of what you're doing and trying to deploy things into the field actually sometimes enhance the experimental capabilities, right, that can be brought to bear on the science. So there's a very powerful feedback loop there. I think it's a very, very effective thing. In terms of my own story and how I sort of got involved in this stuff, it sort of predates Bell Labs. I started a company out of graduate school at MIT. So back when I was graduating, they had the business plan competition, right? It's a very new thing at that time. I think MIT is probably the only place that had it. It was like you win $10,000, if you're kind of the winner. And so we took that opportunity to take some of the laser-based metrology measurement techniques that we were developing as part of my PhD process and teamed with MBA students from Sloan School, put together a business plan. That turned into a real company because the panel of judges consisted of prominent VCs in the Boston area. They funded it 3 years later. We exited, back to Eli's point around greed. I mean, boatloads of cash, and that was cool. Let's do that again, right? So that became sort of a defining moment for me, and sort of established sort of a model for doing things in the future.
So a very specific question for you from the audience is, are you your own guinea pig, and what were those sensors that you were wearing?
Oh, you got to engage with the technology. I mean, you got to get into it. You wouldn't be doing it if it weren't fun. At that level. So yeah, the device on my forearm is a microfluidic platform that allows you to capture very tiny volumes of sweat, microliter volumes of sweat. But it turns out that there's a lot of interesting chemistry in sweat that reflect, in many cases, blood chemistry. And so you can do this then non-invasively characterize the chemical status of your health without the blood draw. That was kind of the idea. But as a model for how things have sort of played out over the last 5-6 years, we published that paper. It's purely scientific in its orientation. It captures some interest in the broader press. And then we get phone calls from companies who want to work with us, and one of them was from Gatorade. You can imagine, Gatorade wants to sell a little patch, you put it on your skin, it tells you when you need to drink more Gatorade, right? And so, yeah. And so it turns out Gatorade's headquarters is in Chicago. It's like fantastic. The president of Gatorade lives right around the corner from me, so it's like an amazing coincidence. So we've really kind of pursued that. They funded our research. We put a company in place to allow us to do the technology translation and the manufacturing, and so it was unveiled in a commercial spot that aired on Christmas Day just a few months ago during NBA games, and a little snippet of it was shown during the video.
Aren't you
So
glad you solved a societal need?
No, it's the first step. Hey, everybody needs Gatorade. You got to be at your peak performance. This is fuel, right, for the athlete. But I think it's a great mechanism for driving the development of the technology, which has medical applications. So we do a very narrow field of use specific license to Gatorade. It just covers sports and performance, athletic performance. And then we can go off and take all that manufacturing capability and the low-cost devices that we produce from Gatorade, and we do things like screening for cystic fibrosis. We have these same device platforms adapted for that application. We have them in the Laureate Children's Hospital, so they're being used on kids. We have devices that are being deployed on stroke patients. There's a right-left body asymmetry in sweat rate, it turns out, as a result of a stroke. And that serves a very powerful metric for tracking the progression of a stroke patient as they move through a rehabilitation protocol. We have devices that we've deployed with the National Kidney Foundation to track hydration in patients who have kidney disorders. You can also measure creatinine levels in sweat. They correlate to creatinine levels in blood. And that's a very important diagnostic for kidney health. So yes, we are doing things. I could go on and on, by the way. I'll stop there. Yeah, the Gatorade is key. It's a good first step. L'Oreal also. We launched a product with L'Oreal around skin pH.
Now
So
I'm
anyway.
interested.
There's another specific question for you, Francis. You talked about some of your enzymes being used for renewables. How are we on track for renewable fluids for aircrafts to get to reduced greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, for fuels, for aviation fuel is unlikely to be replaced by photovoltaics anytime soon. So there's one very rapidly growing sector of the transportation demands that we really need to supply renewable energy for. And biology does this. Biology takes sunlight, stores it in the form of plants. Microbes can turn that into things that we enjoy every day, like ethanol. But you could also make aviation fuel if you wanted to do that. And that technology has been developed. We started a company back in the 2000s when oil hit $150 a barrel, and we thought we would make some money on that. We can make anything except for money right now. No, but this technology is really very powerful. We fly, Alaska Airlines, United Airlines flies on this, but it's just very hard to compete when you're pumping oil out of the ground and nobody cares whether you're leading to climate change or not. We're not paying the price to society of using resources the way that we're using them now. So I can't change that, but I can at least help provide the technology that's available should we decide to change our behavior.
And Eli, these market forces are very relevant to your work as well. When you think about, how can solar power compete in the energy marketplace? What are some of the external forces that have influenced the direction of your business?
Well, one of the big external forces was tremendous subsidies by China. It seems like every province in China wanted to be the world capital of building solar panels. The good news is because of this price war among them, the price of solar panels has come way down. And so people would ask me, should I install solar panels? I say, wait a couple of years, the price will be lower, and it happened. I think it's good time now if you're inclined in that direction. So we're hit by influences of that type, but somehow I don't like the subsidies. Frankly, the Chinese are very unhappy because all those big plants that they built are losing money. And so it's like you buy a solar panel, it's like they attach a $5 bill to each solar panel. It's because they're losing on it. I don't think these things are necessarily constructive because we actually have to improve the technology, and then it'll be able to stand on its own. And so I think that's an important factor in that particular industry. Now, with regard to the airplanes, I've thought about the airplanes quite a bit, and one of the things that has been sort of neglected is that we can actually work on the carbon dioxide problem using biomass and burying biomass, not necessarily converting it to liquid fuel, because we have no shortage of liquid fuels.
Put those dinosaurs back down under the...
Yes, that's right.
So I want to shift gears a little bit because I think we have some students in the audience and we have some questions about your process and also about science and education in today's world. So to start out with kind of a broad question, when are you at your most creative? Is it that cup of coffee in the morning?
I have a very simple answer. I was a manager, and then I changed companies. I wasn't a manager anymore. It was fantastic.
So words of wisdom and void management.
Yeah. I like to shoot basketball. You know, I shoot around and I get the juices flowing a little bit. Some people like walking or whatever, but I like to shoot basketball. Good thoughts come at that time for me.
Do you have any special secrets, words of wisdom?
Work with people who are smarter than you are. That's a really great way.
That's really good advice.
And encourage people to put out risky ideas and not stomp on them right away. Maybe later, but.
So obviously, you know, we work with a lot of students and teachers in a variety of school settings. But one thing we do here is, you know, how do we continue to encourage STEM education in schools? What do you see as the opportunity for scientists to influence STEM education, and especially being at the universities that you're at, what kind of influence do you see colleges and universities playing, and what filters down in terms of encouraging STEM education in schools? Sure, why don't you take a stab at it? Easy question there.
Yeah, I don't know, you know, how the other panelists think about things, but you know, I think as a university professor, my number one emphasis is on the students. I mean, it really is. I mean, the science is great. We do research with the best of them and try to do the translational piece and all that kind of stuff is important for me. But I think training the next generation is the way that I can have the greatest impact, like, over time. And I think classroom instruction is one thing. Getting into the lab is a whole different experience. I think most students find it to be really engaging and exciting in a way that, you know, classroom work just is not. And so when I was an undergraduate, I decided to get into a faculty's lab as a chemist, Dick Legault, back at University of Texas at Austin. And that was kind of a formative thing for me. To have that experience. And so I've always had a kind of an open door policy in terms of allowing undergrads into the lab. If they're interested, they contact me. There's no threshold, there's no requirement around GPA or anything like that. You want to get in, you're in. I mean, I view that as part of my educational responsibilities. So we've had over the years like huge numbers of undergrads. Like back at U of I, we typically have 80 undergrads in the group at a given time. Northwestern's a little bit smaller, so it's typically 30 during the regular school year, balloons up a little bit in the summer, maybe 50. And I think that's a good mechanism for me, at least, to sort of, you know, advance the STEM, you know, process and to help people who are interested to kind of get, you know, started on their own career and thinking about research and so on. So that's been an emphasis for us over the years.
So I worry a lot about society, how you know, how it's going to muddle through, and we don't have enough kids going to STEM, and we have all these problems, and it's very difficult to kind of twist them around and say, no, really, you ought to go into STEM. So they don't listen. But I take heart from this building, because I thought, oh, this is named after Benjamin Franklin. Oh, what was his STEM education? Oh, okay. Oh, so somehow people will step forward, and I think science will carry on. It's much better if we have more STEM-trained people, but somehow someone will step into the breach and do the science that society needs.
You talk about how Sputnik inspired you, right? We don't have that kind of vision, right, anymore. I was just at the Kennedy Space Center, and it's so moving to see what we were able to do as a nation, and the big visions that we had. So, coming from Los Angeles, the second best is movies. And when you talk to a lot of science, what really got you interested early on? If you didn't have Sputnik, a lot of it is movies. So what did I do a couple weeks ago? I was on Big Bang Theory.
Really glad you brought that up. You beat me to it.
I got to play myself on Big Bang Theory. That's the good news. The bad news is the show is over. And a lot of people think there's science on that show. Well, I'll tell you a secret. Sheldon doesn't know any science. But it reaches a tremendous number of people, and entertainment reaches a lot of people. So to the extent that at least those of us in LA can train a few screenwriters to get science portrayed in some interesting fashion, that's a good way to reach out to a much bigger audience and also younger. Yeah. Where I mean, Caltech, they're already nerds by the time they come to Caltech. They're sold.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to ask you about this idea of then communicating science, especially as you said, Francis, in the absence of some kind of national vision at this moment. Thinking about interdisciplinary connections is really interesting, and so you mentioned film, and you've also worked with the National Academies in terms of advising screenwriters. John, your technology has been in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, as part of almost like a technology and fashion exhibition. Where do you see these opportunities arising in terms of inspiring the next generation of scientists?
Well, I think it has to get out into the broader public. I think Francis mentioned this, through movies. I mean, my own experience, that Gatorade commercial, I think it has 110 million views now on YouTube. And so, if you can find intersection points between science and engineering and technology and kind of everyday things that people are thinking about, and touch a broader cross-section of the public, you can use that maybe as a lever, as a hook to get people thinking about technologies. But I think sort of multimedia experience is very, very important. I mean, some people are better at communicating science than others. I mean, that's just going to be a reality. And so I think museums like this become to play a very, very important role as well. The MoMA exhibit was interesting because I think we're the only technology part of that fashion exhibit. It ran for about 9 months. It was 111 items, like fashion-related items. So removable fingernails, dresses. They had Air Jordans, the very first Air Jordans, all this kind of stuff. And then our sweat patch was there. It was really, really kind of weird. But they selected 3 of those 111 to be inserted into the permanent collection at MoMA. So we're now a permanent part of MoMA. It's the most incredible thing. Like Van Gogh and Degas, and there's our sweat patch. I don't know how that happened, but that was interesting. But a lot of people go through that museum, right? And so they'll see that.
And with your technology, Eli, I mean, it's in everyone's pocket.
Yeah, it is, and it sort of staggers me. We sold 2 billion cell phone antennas. So it's in your cell phone, and it's a bit humbling to realize that you've got a good fraction of the human race is carrying something that you invented right next to their body, and I don't know what to do with that other than make a lot of money.
And maybe the secret is just to get people to ask questions about how does this work, with this technology, in our pocket. Especially, we've been reflecting a lot on the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, and kids are just, their minds are blown when we say that your cell phone has more computing power than all the computers that we use to send people into space. So I think that those kinds of stories and technologies are what get kids interested and inspired. If you were to advise your kids to go into STEM today, so I think this is a fun question from the audience, what fields would you tell them to go into?
Well, we just had and you know more about this, the immunotherapy, and the idea that cancer can be cured. And it turns out my mother was, she was famous for raising funds for cancer research. And she would speak to businessmen, and she would list, she was obviously in her generation, all of these infectious diseases were cured. And for example, one of the more recent ones was polio. And how can we doubt that cancer will be cured? I thought to myself, well, she can say that, but cancer is different. And now, cancer is the same. We're going to cure it. So.
Well, then it's already done, and why would somebody go into it?
There's still much to do, which I'm sure you can explain.
And if you haven't read through the list of laureates, one of our other fellow laureates
But
is,
he did that a long time ago.
Dr. Jim Allison.
And now it's obvious. And I think that the worst way to train someone is to tell them what to go into, because science changes so fast that 20 years from now, it'll be something that you never thought of. And young people are the ones who have to make those choices. So I don't tell somebody, you should do this or you should do that. I listen to what interests them. And then in the end, it has to be something they love to do, because you don't get paid. Only you get paid a lot. Most of us don't get paid that way. You get paid a lot too. But you have to do it because you love it.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work to become a scientist and to learn all that material. And graduate students get paid nothing. So they have to love it.
Yeah, that's kind of my philosophy as well. You got to follow your passions, what you're really interested in, because it's going to be a long slog. There's lots of failures, and if you're not, really motivated, it's just not going to work out for you. But it may sound self-serving. I mean, I think the human body is the frontier, the scientific frontier of
Wait, you weren't going to give any advice.
Well, if I had to give advice to my son, I would tell him the opposite thing. He's going to do the opposite. Whatever I tell him. The teenager,
all
16
the other
years
life
old.
Forms.
Impossible.
Why is it all humans all the time?
Okay, life systems, right? Living systems,
All right,
more
that's
generally
better.
speaking. I think the human brain is, maybe the most sophisticated structure in the universe, known universe, right? And understanding how it operates. I mean, that is a scientific grand challenge with practical consequences, right? In terms of how we think of treating brain disorders. And everybody cares about health. Everybody has a relative or something that's struggling with a health problem. So I think there's a really powerful intersection between science and practical utility in this sort of space of health and the human body.
So you brought up the idea that science is a long slog. There is a lot of failure. And that's something that we always talk about as an essential part of the process of science. What's the most memorable failure that you've had to figure out the answer to?
Well, to me, evolution is just a series of failures, right? And then some success comes up, so it's part of the process. But you have to fail early and often, right? And then run with the things that work.
And I think I've read that you've said that if you try a million things and 999,999 of them don't work, it doesn't matter.
But you find the one that does, yeah, you go with the one that does.
Yeah. So many failures. I don't even know where to start. It's very difficult.
Well, all I can think of, I was working late in the lab one night, and I made the mistake of attaching a plastic tube to a gas bottle of boron trichloride, and it should have really been clamped, and I didn't clamp it, I just pushed it on. And so it decided to push itself off, and there was about a cubic centimeter of boron trichloride entered the lab. Fortunately, it was 10 o'clock at night, there was nobody in the building, but the entire building filled up with billowing white stuff. It wasn't smoke, it was just billowing white stuff that kind of looked like smoke. And I think that was a pretty big failure. There was one other person in the building, the janitor. I went down and said, quit early tonight.
So, we've been talking about, science and science education, but to circle that back to where we started in terms of, framing science in the context of the world that we live in today, we often think about this idea of the credibility of science and how that's being challenged in the information environment that we live in today. So, a question from the audience here is, what can we do to make science more credible? Or at least change the perception of science.
More credible.
Do credible things. Do things that are useful and helpful and interesting and capture people's imaginations.
Yeah, I think when science cured disease, that definitely got everybody's attention. I'm talking about like 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And so we're living off of the credibility that was built off over a period of time. And unfortunately, I see it squandered. I see scientists making unjustified, unwarranted claims. The self-publicity, it's all crazy stuff. And the science reporters are partly to blame as well. They tout things as being big breakthroughs that are actually not breakthroughs. I could give an example from my own experience. So I had a company that I founded, Luxtera, and we were doing silicon photonics. And Intel was a competitor. But they were mostly competing in press releases. And they would put out a press release of some new scientific breakthrough. And gullible reporters would publicize it. And this is something that we had already been shipping commercially for 2 years. Okay? And unfortunately, that's a lot of what you get in science reporting. It has not really been checked out that way. And they will, if a big company like Intel comes and tells them this is a breakthrough, well, it's a big company like Intel. I mean, it's got to be right.
It's interesting that there's any question at all around the credibility of science, right? I mean, I think in some ways it's a lack of inquisitiveness, right? On just what's going on around you, right? Like, how do those little blue LEDs work? It's like a little miracle sitting right there. Like, what in the world is going on in here that allows you to do all these things? Where's this electricity coming from, right? That's all science, but you kind of lose track of it. You kind of take it for granted. So maybe just an enhanced awareness of like how things work, in general. You hop in your car. There's so many things going on there that are founded in science, right? Without that, you wouldn't have any technology.
Well, maybe people are overloaded.
Maybe, or maybe they're so lost in these devices in sort of a virtual world, they're not even really paying attention to what's going on around them physically.
But I
don't
think
know.
Eli's right, though. It's really a matter of trust.
But I think you've both hit on something, which is that when science becomes such a part of our lives that you take it for granted, it almost fades into the background. And we think about this when it comes to curing disease and vaccines. That it's not that we forget how bad these diseases were, and it comes back to what you said, Francis, about reminding people about these core values that we share and what science brings to our lives. And that's something that we certainly try and work with scientists a lot to help them tell that story, because that's not always the way that scientists lead. So as we wrap up, I want to go big again. What do you envision for the future of each of your fields in particular? And what do you think is the next big scientific challenge for our society? You can tackle either one or the other. Or both.
Well, in my field, which is electrical engineering and computer science, artificial intelligence, this is something that just emerged. The importance was only recognized maybe 5 years ago. And so the implications that we're still working through the implications of that. The people who are in it believe it's going to be of equal importance to the internet, and it'll be perhaps more varied. So that's a very big area. And there are so many new ways of doing it. So I would say that the information, knowledge revolution, it continues in ways that we didn't even imagine. Now, I just heard one of the panelists say we don't understand the brain. But if I was a computer scientist, I'd say, well, no, the brain works the same as our artificial intelligence. So it's an opinion.
You disagree.
A highly simplified, idealistic version of the brain.
Would you suggest that the brain is perhaps the
Yeah, I
the
think
big
that's
challenge
a
facing us?
scientific frontier. It's pretty widely appreciated, right, as a grand challenge. It'll probably take many, many years to figure that out. I think a lot of the insights are going to be driven by new tools, which is good for me because I'm a tool guy, right, for studying neuroscience and optical imaging approaches, chemical sensors, different things like that. But like for me, the frontier and the field, as I refer to it, is bioelectronics. So I'm close to a 1 milli Shakespeare, bioelectronics. But sort of a blurring of the distinction between this kind of technology and the human body, right? I mean, I think the skin is a natural point of interface to start with, but eventually migrating these kinds of systems for augmented health, augmented mental capabilities, right, brain power, and so on. So I think that's 20, 30, 40, 50 years, that's a very powerful path to follow, in my opinion. It's kind of my space.
But it's not out of the realm of possibility that
No,
someday
you
we
can kind
could
of see
actually
how it's going to play out.
connect some of these sensors directly to our brains.
I mean, I think it's going to happen. It's things are going in that direction. The problem with these kinds of devices is that they have a lot of potential for unintended consequences, right, and health risks. And as a result, there is a very rigorous but necessary regulatory process that will slow things down compared to what you see in terms of technology evolution in IT or consumer devices. But I think there's a lot of reason to believe that there will be very positive outcomes by moving things in that direction.
So Francis will give you the last word.
Oh.
Where are we headed?
Well, rewriting the code of life is now in our hands, and that's a tremendous opportunity. Also has some potential downsides, but that's never slowed anyone down. And I think that the future, I see very positive benefits coming out of that, because we're heading towards 10 billion people on the planet, and if we continue to make the stuff in our daily lives using the methods that we've always used, we will be buried in plastic and detritus of all sorts. So I would like to see us move towards a much more sustainable, biologically based system of creating stuff, feeding us, clothing us, housing us, and that's going to happen. It's really a wonderful and exciting future to look into.
Well, I'd like to thank all three of you for sharing your experiences and thoughts and insights with us tonight. And I can guarantee that all of these topics will be food for thought at our future speaker series events. I'd like to end with a couple of closing notes. First is that we do always appreciate your feedback on our events, so you'll be receiving a link with a survey, and please take a few minutes to let us know what you thought of tonight's program and give us ideas for future events. One other event to let you know about, that's happening tomorrow morning if you're able to join us, is that our guests tonight, as well as the other laureates, will be speaking with our museum visitors on the floor with activities that help us understand what their groundbreaking discoveries were. So we invite you to join us for Laureates Laboratory tomorrow morning. And finally, the next event in our speaker series will be on May 7th. We'll be talking about climate change and climate communication with Dr. Richard Alley, who's a glaciologist from Penn State. So that should be another fascinating conversation. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and thank you as always for your support.